D. Volkov pulled his black Maybach through the iron gates of his New Jersey estate just after 7. And for a man whose face hadn't softened in 2 years, the expression he wore tonight was almost unrecognizable, even to himself. On the passenger seat sat a pale blue Tiffany box tied with a white ribbon, a 5-strand diamond bracelet he'd commissioned 3 months ago and told no one about. Not Pavel, not his attorney, not anyone. Because some things, if you say them out loud before they happen, stop being yours. Tonight was their 5th anniversary. Natalia thought he was still in a sit-down with the Orbakov brothers in Manhattan. He'd left the table early and told Pavel to handle the rest, the way a man says something he means absolutely, with no explanation and no room for argument. Because for one night, Dmitri Volkov had decided to be a husband instead of a boss. He stepped out into the cool May evening, straightened his jacket, and walked to the front door of the home he had built. The kind of house that looked from the outside like everything inside it was perfectly in order. He had believed that for 5 years. He pushed the door open and heard her before he saw her. Natalia's voice. A voice he had always known as composed, precise, and low. The voice of a woman who chose every word like a piece of jewelry. It was coming from the foyer, and it was none of those things. It was stripped raw. It carried a cold viciousness that hit Dmitri in the chest before his mind could catch up, the way your body recognizes danger before you can name it. He stepped into the foyer. His wife stood in a red gown on the marble floor, and at her feet, on her hands and knees, one arm braced against the ground, the other raised to shield herself, was Anya Morozova, his estate's financial manager. The woman who had quietly rebuilt his entire property accounting system for 14 months without a single error or a single late morning. Around her, scattered across the marble like wreckage, were documents, financial printouts, an audit report cracked open at the spine, and beside her hand, screen shattered, a phone that had been thrown. Natalia's hand was still outstretched. For one frozen second, no one moved. Dmitri stood in the doorway holding the Tiffany box, looking at his wife standing over a woman on the floor of his own home, and something inside him that had nothing to do with strategy simply broke. The box slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble with a sound that was very small and very loud at the same time. The white ribbon came loose. The box skidded across the floor and came to rest against one of the scattered documents. Natalia spun around, and Dmitri saw something he had never once seen in 5 years of marriage: fear on his wife's face. Not fear of him, fear of being seen. It lasted less than a second before the composure returned, like a curtain falling back into place, and her voice came out silk again. "Dima, what are you doing home so early?" But Dmitri wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Anya Morozova, slowly lowering the arm she'd raised to protect herself. When she looked up at him, her eyes held something he hadn't expected. Not panic, not pleading, something quiet and exhausted and completely steady. The look of a person who had already decided what they were willing to pay and paid it. He said nothing. He walked past his wife, past the documents, past the shattered phone, down the east corridor. His footsteps made no sound on the marble the way they never did. He closed the study door, turned the lock, and stood in the dark. Not at the Tiffany box on the floor, not at the white ribbon, not at any of it. Because one question was already carving itself into his mind with the slow, cold precision of everything he'd built his life around. What was in those documents? And underneath that, quieter, the question that was going to cost someone everything. How long has she been hiding it? But here's what Dmitri Volkov didn't know yet. The woman on that marble floor wasn't losing a fight when he walked in. She was trying to protect him. And the woman in the red gown, the one whose real voice he had just heard for the first time, she wasn't finished. Not even close.
20 minutes after the study door locked, she knocked. 3 counts, measured. The knock of someone who had used the time it took to walk down the east corridor and change out of a red gown to decide exactly how this conversation was going to go. Dima. Her voice through the door was everything it always was. Low, warm, careful as a hand placed on a wound. "Can I come in?" Dmitri counted to 5 in his head, an old habit from rooms where the wrong answer cost more than money. "Come in," he said. The door opened. She had changed. The red gown was gone. In its place, a dove-gray silk wrap he had once told her he admired over dinner. And she remembered because Natalia Volkova forgot nothing that could be useful later. Her hair was gathered loosely at her neck. Her eyes carried exactly the right level of redness, enough to read as wounded, not enough to look desperate. Everything about her, from the fabric to the way she held the door handle as she eased it shut, was a decision. She sat in the chair across the desk, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with the green eyes that had looked at him across a table at her father's estate dinner 9 years ago and made him think this was a woman worth knowing. He was beginning to understand what kind of knowing that had been. "I know what you saw looked frightening," she said. Her voice was level, reasonable, the voice of someone walking a man carefully back from a ledge. "But you need to hear what's been happening before you draw conclusions, Dima. You need to hear it from me." And she began. Anya Morozova, she said, had been making errors in the estate accounts for weeks. Misclassified expenditures, vendor payments that didn't reconcile. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as carelessness, but the pattern had grown. When Natalia had finally confronted her tonight with the documentation, Anya had become irrational. She'd thrown the papers, she'd reached for her phone, she'd become physical first. "I was frightened," Natalia said, and let the words sit a moment before she continued. "I know it looked wrong, I know how it must have appeared, but I've been trying to protect you from this for weeks, Dima. You always say, bring me the full picture, not pieces, so I waited until I had it." She paused. "I was doing it for you." Dmitri looked at his wife. He watched the tears arrive, slow, deliberate, perfectly timed, landing at precisely the moment the story needed softening. He watched her hands, still folded, still controlled. The hands of a woman performing stillness rather than feeling it. In 20 years, he had sat across from men in rooms where the wrong read meant everything. He had learned to watch the small things, the way a jaw holds tension, the way breath changes when a lie costs something, the way truly still hands are never as still as they appear. He had been wrong about people before, not often, but enough to know the feeling of looking at a face and understanding somewhere behind your sternum that the architecture of what you believed is already coming apart. He felt it now. "I appreciate you explaining," he said. His voice came out the way it did at the beginning of negotiations. He had already decided the outcome, neither warm nor cold, flat as a table you're about to clear. "I'll review the accounts myself." A small nod, gracious, exactly calibrated. She rose, smoothed her dress, crossed to the desk, and placed her hand over his for a moment, warm, familiar, the weight of 5 years, then left, closing the door so softly it made no sound at all. Dmitri sat alone. The desk lamp was still off. He hadn't moved. The burner phone was already in his hand before he was fully aware of reaching for it, the muscle memory of a man who had survived by moving before the moment passed. Pavel picked up on the second ring. "I need everything on Anya Morozova. Every account she's touched, every file, every communication, 14 months back. And I want the full estate financial architecture on my desk before sunrise. Every vendor, every outflow, every layer." Pavel didn't ask why. That was why Pavel had lasted 20 years. "By 4, he said, and the line went dead. Dmitri set the phone down. Outside the dark window, the May garden sat perfectly still, white columns reflected in the fountain pool, everything exactly where it had always been. He had built all of it, and somewhere inside those walls, buried in accounts he had trusted someone else to manage, was the shape of something he hadn't been meant to find. He sat in the dark and waited for sunrise, because by morning he would know exactly what he was living inside. And D. Volkov had spent his entire life making sure that when he finally saw the truth of something, he was never surprised twice.
Pavel's file arrived at 3:47 in the morning, and Dmitri read it twice before the sun came up. Not because it was complicated, because it was the opposite of complicated. Clean, precise, and pointed in a direction he hadn't wanted to look. The estate's vendor accounts had 3 layers he hadn't authorized, small disbursements staggered over 22 months, routed through 2 holding companies he didn't recognize. Nothing large enough to trigger an automatic flag. Everything deliberate enough to tell him someone understood exactly where the thresholds were. He closed the laptop. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he changed his schedule without telling anyone. He came home at noon instead of 6, then at 11, then twice before breakfast on a Wednesday. He moved through his own estate the way he had once moved through hostile territory, quietly, without pattern, missing nothing. It was a skill the underworld had carved into him before he was 20, and he had never once had cause to use it inside his own home. Until now. What he saw was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was consistent. On Monday, he came through the east corridor and heard Natalia in the kitchen speaking to Konstantin, his driver, 51 years old, a man who had driven Dmitri's father before he drove Dmitri. And the tone she used turned his stomach. Not raised, not violent, quieter than that. The tone of someone who has decided another person's dignity is an inconvenience. Konstantin stood at the counter with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes down, absorbing it, the way a man absorbs something he has learned there is no point in answering. Dmitri stood in the corridor and said nothing. He filed it. On Thursday, he found Mrs. Irina Belova, the estate's head housekeeper, 11 years on the property, a woman who had once quietly rearranged an entire state dinner when a supplier canceled 4 hours before guests arrived, sitting in the linen room with the door half closed, folding napkins with the mechanical stillness of someone using their hands to stay calm. She looked up when she heard him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not relief. The careful blankness of a person who had learned that showing the wrong expression in this house carried a cost. "Everything all right, Irina?" he said. "Of course, Mr. Volkov," she said. "Just getting ahead of the weekend." He nodded. He left her alone, but he stood in the corridor outside for a moment before he moved on, and he thought about the 11 years she had worked in this house, and how, in all of them, he had never once had cause to hide in a room. Then came Saturday. He entered through the service entrance at the back of the property, the one that opened into the passage behind the east office. His footsteps made no sound on the tile. He was 12 feet from the door when he heard it, Natalia's voice, coming through the gap where the door sat a half-inch open, and this time there was no performance in it, no silk, no construction, just the cold, stripped-down instrument he had heard once before, on an evening in May with a Tiffany box in his hand. "If you take those files anywhere near him, I will make sure you never hold a professional license in this country again. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Do you understand who my father is?" A silence. Then Anya's voice, quiet, steady, and giving nothing away. "I understand," she said. "Good. Then we don't need to have this conversation again." Dmitri stood motionless in the passage. He had heard threats before. He had made them. He knew the difference between the threat of someone who has lost control of a situation and the threat of someone who has been running one. What he had just heard was the second kind. He walked back out the way he came without making a sound. He sat in the Maybach in the rear garage for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then he picked up the burner phone. "Pavel," he said, "I need cameras. Every room except the bedroom.
Smallest available, tomorrow while she's in the city. How many? Pavel said. All of them, Dmitri said.
The cameras went in on a Tuesday while Natalia was at her spa appointment in the city. 14 of them, each one no larger than a coat button, set into corners and fixtures and the undersides of shelves, with the kind of precision that only comes from people who have done this in places where being found means not coming home. Pavel's team was in and out in under 3 hours. By the time Natalia's car came back through the gate that evening, the estate looked exactly as she had left it. Dmitri didn't rush the footage. He waited. He went about his days the way he always had: meetings, calls, the restaurant group's quarterly review, a land acquisition in Jersey City that needed his signature. He sat across from Natalia at dinner and listened to her talk about a gallery opening she wanted to attend, and he passed the bread, and he refilled her glass, and he gave her nothing. He had been doing this his entire life, waiting, watching the thing take its own shape before he moved. Patience wasn't a virtue in his world, it was a weapon. The footage answered his questions on the 4th day. He watched it alone, after midnight, study door locked, the only light the cold blue of the laptop screen. He moved through the dining room camera first, the corridor camera, the kitchen, and what he saw in each of them confirmed everything the 11 years of Irina's careful blankness had been telling him without words. Then he opened the East office feed from the previous Wednesday at 11 p.m., and he sat very still for what came next. Natalia is entering the office alone, moving directly to Anya's desk with the focused economy of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Photographing documents with her phone, methodical, page by page, unhurried. Then sitting in Anya's chair and making a call that lasted 41 minutes. Pavel had already traced the number by the time Dmitri reached the end of the footage. Gennady Petrov. Dmitri sat back in the leather chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Petrov, 54 years old, St. Petersburg born, operating out of a legitimate shipping consultancy in Midtown that everybody in the Northeast understood was not primarily about shipping. The one man who had spent 7 years looking for a clean way into Dmitri's network and finding none, because Dmitri had spent 7 years making sure there was none. Until now. Until a 41-minute phone call from inside his own estate, on his own Wi-Fi, from his own wife's phone. He opened the second file Pavel had left in the encrypted folder. Anya Morozova's personal background, the full picture, not the professional summary. He read it slowly. Her mother, Halina, 58 years old, Ukrainian-born, diagnosed with congestive heart failure 3 years ago. Medication costs run at $2,800 a month, partially covered, never fully. Her younger sister, Darya, 21, had withdrawn from Rutgers halfway through her 2nd year when the family account hit 0. There was a medical debt figure at the bottom of the summary that Dmitri looked at for a long time without moving. Then he went back to the financial audit, the one Anya had compiled, the one that was scattered across the foyer floor the night he came home with a Tiffany box and his wife's real voice for the first time. He read it from the first page. $4.2 million, moved across 22 months through 3 shell vendors registered to a holding company in Natalia's maiden name, routed into 2 offshore accounts, one in Cyprus, one in Montenegro, in increments small enough to stay beneath every automatic threshold. The architecture was careful, patient, the work of someone who had been planning an exit long before Dmitri had any reason to suspect there was a door. Anya had found all of it and documented every thread, compiled 43 pages of evidence, walked it to the foyer, and was dragged to the floor before she could put it in his hands. She hadn't been the problem. She had been the only person in this house trying to protect him.
Dmitri closed the laptop. The room was completely silent. He looked at the dark window for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 8 months. "Caution," he said. "I have work for you."
He started crossing paths with her the next morning. Not by accident. Dmitri Volkov hadn't done anything by accident since he was 19 years old, but carefully, without pressure, the way you approach something you don't want to startle. He walked through the East office at 8 while she was reviewing the vendor reconciliation files he had asked Pavel to leave on her desk. She looked up. He nodded. He kept walking. That was all. The second morning, he stopped and asked a question about the property filing structure for the Jersey City acquisition. A genuine question, one that required a real answer. She gave it without hesitation, precise, complete, no performance. When he followed up with the second question, she answered that too, and then returned to her work without waiting to see if the conversation was going to become something else. She didn't try to steer toward what she knew, didn't angle toward the documents, the foyer, the night with the shattered phone. She simply did the work in front of her, the way she had apparently been doing it for 14 months, while everything around her was quietly unraveling. On the third morning, he brought 2 coffees to the East office and set one on her side of the table without comment. She looked at it, then at him. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him she was deciding something. Then she picked it up, and they sat across from each other reviewing quarterly statements for 40 minutes while the morning came in through the east windows. She spoke when the work required it. She didn't fill the silence for the sake of filling it. In a life constructed almost entirely of people who spoke to manage him, to position themselves, to ask for things, to stay close to what he represented, the absence of that was something Dmitri felt physically, like a pressure releasing in a room. On the 5th morning, he asked her directly, not about the accounts, not about Natalia. "Why are you still here?" She didn't look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading, set her pen down, and then looked at him with the same steady, undecorated attention he had noticed the first time she raised her eyes to his on the foyer floor. "Because the accounts aren't closed yet," she said, "and because somebody has to finish the work." Dmitri looked at her for a moment. That's the only reason? She considered it honestly. He could see her considering it, which was itself unusual in a world where people answered questions before they finished hearing them. "I've been finishing work other people left undone my whole life. I don't know how to stop in the middle." She picked up her pen and went back to the page. He thought about the file Pavel had built, the medical debt, Darya's withdrawal from Rutgers, the $2,800 a month that had to be found every 30 days or her mother's treatment protocol collapsed. He thought about 14 months of walking into this estate, doing precise and honest work, absorbing whatever Natalia aimed at her, and showing up again the next morning at 8 o'clock, because the alternative was a cost she couldn't pay. She hadn't told him any of that, hadn't used it, hadn't laid it on the table as leverage or sympathy or explanation. In his world, information about a person's desperation was currency. Everyone spent it eventually, usually on themselves. She was sitting 3 feet away from the one man who could dissolve every problem in that file with a single phone call, and she had not once opened her mouth to ask. He had known men who would have sold what she knew to Petrov before the week was out, men who would have disappeared quietly with whatever they could carry, men who would have hired attorneys and made noise. She had shown up the next morning and kept working. Dmitri picked up his coffee. Outside, the June light was moving across the garden in long, clean angles, catching the white peonies she had planted along the south wall sometime in the past month. He hadn't noticed them until now, which told him something about how much of his own house he had stopped seeing. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked back at the woman across the table who had been trying to hand him the truth and asked her about the Jersey City filing and listened to her answer and said nothing else. But that evening, alone in his study, he opened a different drawer, not the one with the burner phone, the one where he kept the contact information for his private attorney, Elena Kosmova. He had some arrangements to make.
The arrangements Elena made were quiet, layered, and airtight, the way Dmitri requested everything. Through 3 clean entities, funds moved into a private medical support foundation that existed on paper as a community health initiative for immigrant families in the tri-state area. Helena Morozova's cardiologist called her within the week with news about a qualifying grant. Darya received a re-enrollment scholarship notification from Rutgers Financial Aid Office 2 days after that. Dmitri was in a property meeting in Midtown when his phone showed a missed call from an unknown number. He didn't need to check it. He already knew what it was. That evening, he came through the east corridor at the usual hour and found Anya in the office, still at her desk, phone face down, hands flat on the surface of either side. She had the stillness of someone who had just received news large enough to require the body to catch up with the mind. She didn't hear him stop in the doorway. He left without announcing himself. The camera footage came the following night. Kashin had flagged it with a single word in the encrypted message thread, "Tonight," which in Kashin's language meant what it always meant: you need to see this before you make another move. Dmitri opened it at 11, study door locked, no lights. The East office feed, 9:40 p.m., 3 days prior, an evening Dmitri had been at a restaurant group dinner in the city. Natalia entering through the side passage door, not the main corridor, the side passage, the one the household staff used, which told him everything about how long she had understood the camera blind spots of her own home. She crossed to Anya's desk, but she wasn't photographing files this time. Anya was still there, working late, and she rose when Natalia entered with the instinctive wariness Dmitri had seen in her since the beginning, that fractional stiffening of the shoulders, the body's private alarm system. Natalia moved toward her without slowing. What happened next was brief and absolutely deliberate. She took Anya by the collar of her jacket, walked her backward into the filing cabinet, hard enough that the metal rang, and held her there. Her face was 3 inches from Anya's. Her voice was low enough that the audio barely caught it, but Kashin had cleaned and amplified the track. "You think he'll choose you," Natalia said, "a woman who came in through a job listing. Let me explain something to you about who you are in this house and who you will always be." She released her, smoothed the front of her own blouse, and walked out. Anya stood against the filing cabinet for a long moment without moving. Then she straightened her jacket, sat back down at the desk, and went back to work. Dmitri closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the desk without meaning to, the way you watch something neutral when you need your mind to stay cold. In his life, he had made decisions that ended careers, dissolved partnerships, and closed doors on men who had believed themselves untouchable. He had made them all from this same place, the flat, pressureless center that existed on the other side of anger, where everything became simple and sequential and clear. He stood up, walked to the dressing room, pulled down the largest of Natalia's cases from the upper shelf, the graphite Rimowa she had bought in Paris on a trip he had paid for, and began to fill it. Not carelessly, not brutally, with the same economy he brought everything that needed to be finished. He wheeled it to the bedroom door. The sound of the case on the hardwood woke her. She sat up in the dark. "Dima, what time is it?" "Time to go," he said. The silence that followed was very long. "I'm not leaving my home," she said, and her voice had found its composure again, the silk back in place. He looked at her across the dark room with the flat, complete attention of a man who has finished deciding. "It was never yours. It was always mine, and I want you out of it." She didn't leave quietly. She tried tears first, the good ones, the ones that had worked on him before, slow and precisely placed. When those landed on nothing, she moved to the marriage. 5 years, everything they had built. Did that mean nothing to him? Was he really going to do this over a misunderstanding, over an employee, over one bad night? Dmitri stood in the doorway and let her speak. He had learned a long time ago that interrupting a person mid-performance only extended it. You waited, you let it run its course, and when the silence came, you spoke into it before they could refill it with something else. The silence came. "My attorney will contact yours in the morning," he said. "Everything you came into this marriage with will be returned to you in full, nothing more." Her face changed. The tears went away, not gradually, but all at once, the way a screen goes dark when the power cuts. What replaced them was something older and harder and considerably more honest. "You have no idea what you're starting," she said. "I know exactly what I'm starting," Dmitri said. "That's why I'm the one starting it." Pavel's car was already at the gate. He had called it 2 hours before waking her, because Dmitri Volkov did not make moves without the next 3 steps already in place. She dressed in the dark without another word, dragged the Rimowa to the door, and walked down the staircase with the rigid, over-controlled posture of a woman holding her dignity together by its last thread. At the front door, she stopped, turned. The look she gave him wasn't grief and it wasn't fury. It was the look of a calculation being revised in real time, a mind moving behind composed features, filing the evening into a category he recognized immediately. Not a loss, a delay. The car took her through the gate. Dmitri watched the taillights disappear through the security feed, then closed the monitor and sat for a long time doing nothing. The house changed the next morning in ways that were small and said everything. Constantine arrived at 6 and moved through the motor court with the unhurried ease of a man who had remembered he was allowed to take up space. He whistled something low and tuneless while he checked the car, an old habit, Dmitri realized, that he hadn't heard in months without being able to say exactly when it had stopped. Mrs. Irina Belova set the breakfast table with the focused quiet of someone working from genuine care rather than managed anxiety. She asked Dmitri if he wanted the dining room windows opened. A small thing, the kind of small thing a person stops asking when they've learned that expressing a preference carries a risk. He told her yes. The staff moved through the estate differently, not visibly, not dramatically, but Dmitri had spent his life reading rooms, and what he felt in this one was the particular quality of air that returns to a space when the source of its tension has been removed. Like a hand unclenching, like a held breath finally let go. He noticed it most in Anya. She arrived at 8, same as always, same desk, same files, same precise and unhurried attention to the work in front of her. But the fractional stiffening he had catalogued every time footsteps entered the corridor, that involuntary brace, the body's private preparation for impact, was quieter now, not gone, but quieter. She didn't mention Natalia, didn't ask what had happened or what came next. She reviewed the Cyprus account documentation Cashin had flagged and left a clean summary on his desk by mid-morning with a paper-clipped note in her small, level handwriting. 3 additional disbursements not in the original audit, dates attached. Dmitri read it twice. Then he walked to the doorway of the East office and looked at her for a moment, head down, pen moving, entirely absorbed in work that nobody had asked her to continue. "Anya," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives just behind one, in the place where a person keeps what they don't yet trust enough to show. "The accounts aren't closed yet," she said, and went back to work. It arrived on a Wednesday morning at 7, the way the most dangerous things always arrive, quietly, through official channels, wearing the face of procedure. Pavel called while Dmitri was still in the car returning from an early meeting in Jersey City. His voice had the particular flatness it took on when the news required the body to stay level while the mind processed the weight of it. Federal financial crimes complaint filed this morning against Anya Morozova, he said, alleging embezzlement of estate funds, systematic misappropriation over 14 months. The filing is detailed, Dima. Whoever built it knew exactly which accounts to cite. Dmitri said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the turnpike moved past in gray morning light. Who received it? IRS Criminal Investigation and FBI Financial Crimes, joint intake. There are 2 agents already requesting a preliminary interview at the estate. Tell them Thursday, Dmitri said. Give me today. He ended the call. He looked out the window a moment longer. Then he called Kashin. By noon, the complaint was on his desk in the study, printed and annotated. He read it with the slow, structural attention he gave to things that had been engineered to deceive, looking not at what it said, but at the decisions behind what it said, which accounts it cited, which dates it selected, which figures it used. Every number in the complaint was real. Every account reference was accurate. The dates aligned precisely with the audit trail Anya had compiled, because the complaint had been built from that audit, the one Natalia had photographed from Anya's desk on a Wednesday night through the side passage door, while Kashin's cameras recorded every page. She had taken Anya's own evidence and reframed it, turned the documentation of Natalia's theft into the documentation of Anya's. It was, Dmitri thought, with the cold detachment of someone who had spent a lifetime among dangerous people, an impressive piece of construction. Patient, surgical, the work of someone who had been planning the second move before the first one was finished. He called Elena Kaznova at 12:30. "I need you here at 2, he said. "Bring whoever you need." Then he walked to the East office. Anya was at her desk. She looked up when he entered, and he could see in her face that she already knew, the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had seen coming but hoped wouldn't land. Her phone was face down on the desk. He understood she had already received calls she wasn't answering. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since 9 this morning," she said. "A former colleague sent me the intake filing." "Why didn't you call me?" She looked at him steadily. "Because it isn't your problem to fix," she said. "It's mine." Dmitri pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Not the posture of an employer, not the posture of a boss, just a man sitting across a desk from someone he needed to speak to directly. "It was built from your audit," he said. "The accounts she photographed. She inverted the entire trail and filed it against you." Anya was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, something closer to the grim recognition of a person watching a pattern complete itself. "Then she has a copy of everything," she said. "Yes. And she gave it to someone." "Petrov," Dmitri said. His attorney made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning. They're moving on the warehouse network. The room was very quiet. Through the east window, the garden sat in flat afternoon light, the white peonies along the south wall holding still in the windless air. Anya looked at the window for a moment, then back at him. "She built it from 2 directions," she said quietly. "Federal exposure from one side, Petrov from the other, so regardless of which way you move." "There's no clean exit," Dmitri said. "Yes." He watched her absorb that. She didn't fold. She didn't reach for reassurance. She simply sat with it the way she sat with everything, squarely, without flinching, without asking to be relieved of it. "Kashin is already working. Elena arrives at 2. We have everything she used to build it, and we have the footage of her building it." He stood. "This ends once, and it ends completely."
The invitations went out on a Monday, printed on heavy cream stock with the Volkov Foundation seal embossed in charcoal at the top. 300 of them,
hand-delivered by messenger to the addresses of business leaders, state legislators, federal prosecutors, newspaper owners, and 2 names Dmitri had added to the list himself, in ink, on a Tuesday evening in his study with the door closed. Natalia Volkova, Viktor Sorokin. The event was a fundraising gala for immigrant family medical support, a cause the foundation had backed for 4 years and whose legitimacy was beyond question. Grand ballroom of the Pierre, black tie, cocktails at 7, dinner at 8. Pavel's team had been inside the venue since 5, and by the time the first guests arrived, 14 camera angles covered every corner of the room, and 2 IRS criminal investigation agents, 1 FBI financial crimes officer, and a pair of New York State police detectives were seated at a corner table near the service corridor with signed warrants in a manila envelope between them. Natalia arrived at 7:20 in a slate column gown, her father Victor beside her in a dark 3-piece suit, his silver hair immaculate, his bearing that of a man accustomed to being the most significant person in any room he entered. She moved through cocktail hour with the composed ease of someone who had decided this evening represented Dmitri's attempt to negotiate from weakness. She smiled at people she recognized. She accepted a glass of champagne. She glanced toward the main table with the particular patience of a woman waiting to be approached. She didn't know Pavel had sealed every exit at 6:30. Dmitri took the stage after dinner, and the room settled the way rooms settled around him, not because he asked for it, but because something in his stillness made noise feel unnecessary. He wore a black suit, no tie, and the expression he reserved for moments when the outcome was already decided and only the formality remained. "This foundation exists for one reason," he said, his voice even and unhurried, dropping into the ballroom quiet like something placed rather than thrown. "Because the most consistent injustice in any society is the use of power to destroy people who have none. Tonight, I want to show this room what that looks like from the inside." The screen behind him came to life. The East office footage first. Natalia moving through the side passage door, crossing to Anya's desk, photographing documents page by page with her phone. Then the 41-minute call to Petrov, timestamp visible in the upper corner. Then the filing cabinet footage, brief, silent, and entirely unambiguous. Then Cashin's forensic breakdown of the federal complaint, the original audit documents side by side with the inverted filing, metadata showing both files originated from the same source, a wire transfer of $60,000 to a forensic document firm in Delaware made from an account in Natalia's maiden name 11 days before the complaint was submitted. Then the Petrov correspondence, warehouse schematics sent from a device registered to Viktor Sorokin's holding company, emails between Petrov's attorney and the U.S. Attorney's Office referencing information received from a confidential source with direct access to Volkov estate operations. 300 people in black tie watched Natalia's face change in real time. Elena Kaznova walked to the podium with a document package 7 centimeters thick, set it down without looking at the room, and spoke in the level, irrefutable tone of a woman holding every card at a table she had built herself. Wire fraud, money laundering, filing a false federal complaint, conspiracy to obstruct financial proceedings, conspiracy to interfere with an ongoing federal investigation. The ballroom doors opened. The detectives moved through the room with the unhurried authority of people who had already done the difficult work and arrived only to complete it. The click of the cuffs closing around Natalia's wrists was the only sound in 300 square feet of absolute silence. "You will regret this," she said, her voice finally stripped of everything it had ever been constructed from.
Dmitri looked down at her from the stage with the tired, finished eyes of a man who had stopped being surprised by the things people say when they have nothing left. "I already have," he said. 5 years of it.
The trial lasted 4 weeks. Natalia was convicted on 7 counts. 6 years, the judge said, and the courtroom absorbed it with the particular silence of people who had read the evidence and were not surprised. Viktor Sorokin received 2 counts of financial conspiracy and lost his import licensing across 3 states before the month was out. Gennady Petrov, facing federal exposure through his attorney's correspondence, quietly dissolved his Northeast operations and relocated to a city that didn't know Dmitri Volkov's name and never would. Dmitri didn't stay for the verdict. He had left the courthouse the morning the jury went into deliberations because the outcome had been in his hands before the trial ever began, and there was nothing left in that building he needed. He sold the New Jersey estate 6 weeks later, below market, without negotiating. He couldn't walk the foyer without seeing the pale blue Tiffany box on the marble, the white ribbon loose, the documents spread around Anya's hands like the outline of something he had almost been too late to understand. He sold it to a developer who asked no questions and took possession in 30 days, and Dmitri didn't look back through the gate when he left for the last time. He bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, old oak floors that announced every footstep, tall windows that let in more light than he was accustomed to, a back garden that had been neglected long enough to require serious attention. The neighborhood was quiet in the mornings and loud on weekends, and nobody on the block knew what he did or had done, and that was the first thing about it he genuinely liked. Halina Morozova's cardiac treatment continued under the new protocol. Her cardiologist used the word stabilizing at her 6-month review, and Halina reportedly cried in the examination room, which her cardiologist said he had learned to expect from the good appointments. Daria re-enrolled at Rutgers in September and called her sister from the registration office laughing so hard she could barely form a sentence. Anya stood in the brownstone kitchen listening to her sister's voice and said nothing for a long time after the call ended, just held the phone against her chest in the late afternoon quiet. She opened her consultancy on Atlantic Avenue in the fall, her name on the door, her license reinstated, her terms forensic accounting for private clients who needed someone precise, discreet, and entirely without appetite for compromise. Within 3 months, she had more work than she could comfortably carry, which was a problem she met with the same undramatic competence she brought to everything. Dmitri handed the last of the criminal operations to Pavel in November, not because he feared consequences, not because the law had come close enough to require it, but because he had spent 20 years building something that had never once made him feel the way he felt sitting across an East office desk from a woman reviewing quarterly statements with soil still on her hands from the garden she tended before the working day began. He brought 2 coffees to the brownstone garden every morning, the old habit relocated. Some mornings she was already there when he came out, working the south bed where she had planted white peonies along the wall in September, coaxing them through their first Brooklyn winter with the patient, unhurried attention she gave to everything she had decided was worth keeping. On an evening in late March, when the peonies had finally begun to open and the light over the garden was doing something unhurried and golden that made the whole yard feel temporarily separate from the city around it, Dmitri walked out holding a small black velvet box. Anya looked up from the soil. She looked at the box, then at his face. She went very still. He knelt on the garden path, one knee on the cold stone, and held the box open. Inside, a thin platinum band with a single small stone, nothing architectural, nothing designed to announce itself, something real. You could have walked away, any point along the way. You had every reason, and nobody would have blamed you. He paused.
I want to spend my life next to someone who stays anyway, who does the right thing even when it costs them everything." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes wet, hands still dark with soil. "Yes," she said, "you impossible, stubborn man. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she laughed and pressed her forehead briefly against his, and the peonies held open in the last of the March light, white and unhurried, the way things bloom when they have finally been given enough time.
Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. It keeps these Mafia legends alive. Like, comment, and I'll see you in the next upload.